And at the end of 4 years, I guarantee you that I will get over 95% of the African-American vote. I promise you.
Okay, Trump definitely did not win 95% of the black vote in 2020, but he did increase his share of the black vote from 8% in 2016 to 12% in 2020, which is the highest for a GOP candidate since Bob Dole in 1996 and Ronald Reagan in 1980. First off, my name is James Lee. You're watching 5149, where I discuss political, business, and societal topics every week. And if you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe. It really makes a big difference for a small independent voice like mine. Today, I want to talk about why black people voted for Trump in larger numbers in 2020, despite all the racist things he said and done. And to be honest, I'm probably not the perfect person to prosecute this case for obvious reasons, but I do think that I can make some observations around this phenomenon and talk a little bit about what it can tell us about the future of our electoral politics. So a lot of times I think there is a bit of race reductionism when it comes to discussing who to vote for. The articles that you see on your screen represent just a few of many examples out there, but the reality might be a little bit more complicated than that. John McWhorter, a professor at Columbia University, writes, "The non-white segment of Trump support demonstrates a gulf between how the woke left processes racism and how many people in the real world do. The former assumes that racism is a wedge issue and the most cardinal of human sins. The latter are far less doctrinaire." Essentially what he's saying here in the context of how people cast their vote is that people vote for different reasons and that there is no universal wedge issue. For some, racism is the key issue. For others, it might be the economy or maybe other cultural issues like abortion. That's partly why you saw this huge surge of support for Joe Biden in the suburbs. These voters are generally doing pretty well economically, so Trump's economic populist messaging didn't really matter to them that much, but Trump's moral and cultural baggage was to them unconscionable. Either the racism or the misogyny, it was just too much to bear, even for some Republicans. But there are also many others in this country who are struggling economically, and oftentimes minority communities are in a much more economically perilous position compared to predominantly white communities. So given their economic situation and the choice of candidates, racism might not be their top issue.
Who are you going to vote for today?
More than likely Trump again.
Why?
Well, the black community, I am concerned about us being able to get employment, education for black people. And I believe that that's really a big problem here in Los Angeles, especially for, working class people who are trying to survive and live here. We've been maintaining and trying to survive here, and then we can't get jobs.
I think the key problem with assuming that racism is a wedge issue for everyone is that despite Joe Biden's tone-deaf and inaccurate statement that Trump is our first racist president, I can probably cite a concrete example of how each and every one of our past presidents have been racist or have enacted racist policies. He overlooked obvious examples like President Woodrow Wilson, who as a segregationist wrote a history textbook praising the Confederacy and in particular the Ku Klux Klan, and also rolled back hard-fought economic progress for black Americans, overseeing the segregation of multiple agencies of the federal government. Or President Reagan, who described a Tanzanian delegation as monkeys and also militarized the police force, which has used the war on drugs as a pretext for terrorizing communities of color. Or even President Obama, whose housing policies during the financial crisis led to millions of families losing their homes and destroyed black wealth. A 2013 Center for Responsible Lending study estimated that properties in proximity to a foreclosure shed $2.2 trillion in value, and that half of that loss was in communities of color. So my point is that if the African American community drew the line at racism, there would literally be no viable candidates to choose from, at least from the Democratic or the Republican parties. In 2020, you have Trump, who despite him claiming that he's not a racist, has said and done a bunch of racist things.
You also had people that were very fine people on both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it. President Obama, he is the founder of ISIS. He's the founder of ISIS, okay? He's the founder. He founded ISIS.
Complaining to lawmakers in the Oval Office about protections for immigrants. Why do we want these people from, quote, all these whole countries here? Mr. Trump was referring to African nations and Haiti before suggesting the U.S. should have more people from places like Norway.
And then you have Biden, who, despite him claiming he's not a racist, has also said and done a bunch of racist things.
Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids.
You cannot go to a 7-Eleven or a Dunkin' Donuts unless you have a slight Indian accent. I'm not joking.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
So this framing of if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or for Trump, then you ain't black is ignoring our country's white-dominated society and our struggle with both overt and systemic racism. And running a campaign centered on a message of restoring the soul of the nation might sound all well and good for some, but for many others, it could also mean restoring a system and a culture that has systemically oppressed black people and minorities. Trump, on the other hand, at least made an attempt to appeal to the economic needs of African Americans with proposals like the Platinum Plan that touted increasing capital in black communities by $500 billion. I know the plan sounds super hokey and it's disingenuous, but it's at least more tangible than something like restoring the soul of this nation. And to be clear, both parties, both candidates offered very little, but here's the key difference and why I think Trump was ultimately able to convince more black people to vote for him this time around. The Democratic Party has long been known as the party of minorities, but in recent years, the mask has kind of come off as they have largely failed to deliver anything meaningful to those communities. You can only pretend for so long. Fool me once, people catch on.
In order for us to vote for Biden, we can't be taken for granted like we always are because we're supposed to be Democrats or because people are afraid of Trump. It's whoever's going to take care of our community, whoever wants to make a deal. It's business at this point. We can't trust politicians, so we want to know very clearly, just like Trump made it clear that he wanted to build a wall. Biden needs to make it clear that he's going to change the lives and quality of life of black and brown people, or else he can't get the vote. I will hold the vote hostage if I have to.
So that facade is now gone, or at least it's in the process of decay. I don't know if it's social media or just the internet in general, but it's so much easier to call out hypocrisy nowadays. You can't at the same time claim to be for the African American community and also support a crime bill that has led to their mass incarceration without being put on blast. The last thing I want to talk about is sort of why I wanted to cover this topic in the first place. Black people voting Republican, suburban white people voting Democrat. What is the bigger picture here? What does this all mean for the future of electoral politics? Well, I think the big takeaway is that this shows that racial groups are not monoliths. Political parties shouldn't assume that they are entitled to your vote just because you're black or Latino or any other voting group. Votes should be earned in exchange for something in return. The thing is, I'm not sure if there's a grand realignment happening here. But in the context of voting, I take this phenomenon as a good sign because people aren't just voting blindly for candidates based on if their name has a D or an R next to it. In addition to more black people and Latinos voting for Trump in 2020 than in 2016, there were also a decent number of typical white Republican voters who supported Joe Biden, as evidenced by the Democrats performing really poorly down ballot. I'm thinking optimistically and maybe a little naively here, of course, but during a time where the country has never been more divided, and during a time where identity and team sport mentality dominate politics, this could be a foreshadowing that people, especially communities that have long been taken advantage of, are evaluating candidates based on more than just party identification. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what your takeaways might be and what you think about the future of electoral politics in the US. If you enjoyed my video, please like and subscribe, and also share. It really helps a small independent voice like mine. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I'll see you next week.